My father actually was born in Harlem Hospital, but lived in Brooklyn his whole life. My mom came up from Virginia when she was about 12 years old. And so we have been Brooklyn natives, probably going back 80 some odd years. A lot of what you're seeing here is kind of similar to what I've seen like in the Bay Area, if I'm going to use a Cali reference. But DC has also had very much of the same dynamic as it relates to gentrification. And gentrification really is about two things. It's really less about the building and more about the changes that you've seen demographically with the people who live in a particular community, right? And how it's kind of played itself out in New York City and also particularly in Brooklyn has been kind of two ways, right? And so in some places it's actually been fine in terms of taking areas that were traditionally not well populated or warehouses, like manufacturing areas, and redesigning those communities to be residential, right? So you've seen that in places like Greenpoint and Williamsburg and Brooklyn, and Cobble Hill and downtown Brooklyn, and I think that's been fine and frankly welcomed, right? The negative part of what you've seen is also kind of two dynamics. One, in places like Bed-Stuy, where you've seen rents go up, right? And where you've had people from out of town, primarily white, move into places like Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is actually founded as a free black community, right, with Weeksville, right? And so like people's like, well, how long black people living in that community for 300 years contiguously, right? And then you have places like Flatbush, where what we're having is a community that's primarily 1 and 2 family households, right? Where you've gone into blocks where there were 1 and 2 family homes, knocked down 1 and 2 family homes, and then built these multi-units up. And that's been problematic from a couple of perspectives. One of which, architecturally, they have not built aesthetically to fit within the context of the current landscape that we have developed here already, right? So you have colonials, you have Victorians, and then you come in and you build like something super modern, or you build something that's just horrendous. This looks like a jail cell. You also have a problem of, again, the people who live in the community don't have access to those buildings, and that's really number 3. Really, the number 2 is really what you've done to the other homeowners, right? And so when there's been homes where you've had 1 or 2 family households, typically there's either they're a connected home or there's a driveway but there's some space. And now what they've done is they've knocked down a building and then built to the property line. So now if you're a homeowner in the adjacent building, your kitchen window is now facing a brick wall, right? Or sometimes they've taken homes that are attached or semi-attached, and they've knocked it down and then has now destabilized the integrity of your home. And those practices are just, I think, frankly, are not just callous, but just horrible within the context of developing, a community and keeping a community, stable. You got to understand that Brooklyn is the largest concentration of people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere outside of here, Brazil.
The history of people of African American descent doesn't begin in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, but begins on the continent of Africa. That it's important when you start to study the history of African American people that you remember that people of African descent were the first people on this earth. Not saying they're better, just first. So when you look at Australopithecus, the very first humanoid that they ever found on the continent of Africa. But what's important is not that the first person is found there, but the last person is also found there.
And so in terms of density, right, it's the third largest city, right? Brooklyn just itself is the third largest city in the entire country, right? So, bigger than, other than New York City and LA, bigger than every other city, bigger than Boston, bigger than Philadelphia, bigger than Miami, bigger than Houston, bigger than Chicago, right? And so, and to have the vast majority of those folks, and we'll see that may change in the context of this new census that's coming out this year. But in the last census, again, very, very large population of people of African descent, right? And I describe it that way because they call them African Americans. is not quite the real story, because part of what I think will be revealed in this next census as well is that the vast majority of people living in Brooklyn of African descent are actually either Caribbean descent or African descent. And I think those two categories collectively will outnumber those of us who see ourselves as quote unquote African American. When we look at Brooklyn and the historical development of Brooklyn, it has changed, right, over time. But it still becomes like the, kind of place in which Black hopes and dreams get played out, right? This is the birthplace, right, of Biggie and, and the Dodgers, right, with Jackie Robinson, right, and Spike Lee, right, and Jay-Z, right? To go back to your last question about gentrification, one of the real impacts of gentrification is that people can then no longer, afford to live in the communities in which they grew up, and in which they buried their parents and their grandparents, in which they had their memories, right? And it's different if you decided to go someplace because of better opportunities. It's different when you've been pushed out, when you've been told you can no longer afford to live in this community. When you were here, you were scraping and surviving. And then now, they moved other people in, and now they're fixing the streets and building businesses and doing all these things that they would not allow you to do, right? So a lot of the impacts of gentrification on African American communities has been anger, fear, and frustration, right? And a lot of resentment, over the opportunities that people of African descent weren't afforded because of labor market discrimination, redlining, other dynamics in which whites who controlled capital would not invest in this community until now white people have come in and now they're investing themselves. And so that's been, again, a place of contention. Now, direct to your question, right? The short answer to your question is that I think that you're finding, communities of African descent banding together. And I think that they're, slowly but surely figuring out what the game is. And so, you have real estate groups getting together now, buying their own real estate, people buying their blocks, people, buying their individual houses just to make sure that people have a place to live. I mean, and, frankly, my mother's deceased now, but 20 years ago, my mother saw that. She was a visionary, and she was like, look, we need to buy property. And she made sure that, she helped all of us buy our own homes, so to make sure that you were kind of enshrined in the place. Now, if you decide to sell it whatever later, but she's like, you need to own the place that you live, because eventually this is going to be a place where people are going to want to come, and it's going to be difficult. The house I live in now, I couldn't afford to buy it now if I needed to, right? And I make, a living wage. It ain't great money, but I have a living wage, right? But I couldn't afford to buy the house that I live in now, right? And so, in a lot of communities that way, you're finding a lot of folks here in Brooklyn who are, property rich and cash poor. Yeah. And so, people are trying to kind of figuring out a way. Now, despite all of that, you also have a very large percentage of people who are unemployed here, particularly in the Black community, and that's one of the things that my office has spent a lot of time working on. And in the face of labor market discrimination, a lot of that has meant entrepreneurism, which again, in a community that's primarily Caribbean and African descent, those folks are very much focused on entrepreneurial endeavors. One of the big projects I've worked on with Brooklyn College is a small business development center, and I'm hoping that this year that will be one of the things that we take to another level and make that center more accessible, more available, and provide more both access to capital and technical assistance for people who are trying to live the American dream. I've been serving, this is my 18th year in the New York State Senate.
Brooklyn, it's Flatbush, East Flatbush, Midwood, Ditmas Park, Kensington, and Borough Park. I actually represent 2/3 of Borough Park, and functionally making me the person who represents more Orthodox Jews than any other person who's not a Jew in the state of New York.
All right, and the entire time I've been here, thank you. The entire time I've been here, I've been on the Energy Committee. And I've either been the chairman, or this is my second stint as chairman. But other times I've been what they call a ranking member, right? So they're kind of the head of the Democratic Party on that committee. And so I got appointed last year. We've kind of gone through a whole year of policy proposals around energy and telecom issues. It's very exciting. I mean, when I first got on it, people were like, "Why would you want to be on energy?" And and I think slowly but surely, as I've developed expertise at it, people have kind of really understood. And now that environmental issues like climate change and broadband expansion have come to the fore, people realize I brought sexy back. The issues around broadband expansion and access to things like 5G technology and smart cities and where we're going to go with that, right? Net neutrality and the issues of what we're going to do with the internet and how people have access and how we're going to build or tax people on the internet, right? And so all of those things come out of my committee. Our governor is fond of saying now that we're having 100-year storms every two years, right? And it's a real thing, and so we're really going to have to address this. Else the planet is not going to be, sustainable. People are like, "Oh, we're destroying the planet." I'm like, no, we're not destroying the planet. The planet's not going anywhere. What we're destroying is our ability to live on this planet with any kind of comfortability and sustainability, right? Unless we change our act. If you have a washer and dryer in your house, instead of washing your clothes at 3 p.m., then you should be really washing off peak 10, 11, 12 at night. Yeah. Right, that's when you should be doing your laundry, right, and doing things off peak, and understanding those things both so that you can save money, right, as a consumer, but also so that you can lower your carbon footprint and lower the cost of energy. The transit system is the lifeblood of New York City. You really can't have all the commerce in Wall Street and being the home of Madison Avenue and advertising and telecommunications, right, and communications, the way you're working out of New York unless the transit system is working properly. And ours was underfunded and poorly managed. The governor came forward. We're doing a forensic audit. It was an organization that had 4 different areas. He's now combining them, streamlining the administration, lowering the cost at the top of the organization so that more money can flow into the actual operation of the organization. And we needed to come up with several tens of billions of dollars. We raised about $30 billion in financing that's going to be rolled out over 10 years. Many of the stations, including creating accessibility, right? Because a lot of the stations don't have elevators, so if you're somebody in a wheelchair or have a cane or walker, you can't get into the subway. And so we needed to change that. So we're working on all of those things while simultaneously restructuring the organization and making sure it's more efficient, and that we as legislators who are voting on their budgets understand that this money is being used effectively and in the ways that in which it was properly designed. We don't currently have a president that cares about everybody and is doing his best to take care and balancing the pressures of dealing with everyone.
First, just want to thank our leadership, both Andre Stewart Cousins, our leader, as well as Mike Generis, for just their vision and their willingness to put the important and hard things forward in the state of New York. But certainly want to add my voice to those who...
Some things that frankly are values that are non-negotiable. Access to education, for me, is non-negotiable. Access to healthcare and affordable healthcare is non-negotiable. Everybody should have access. Everybody should be able to afford it. Everybody should be able to get quality and as much healthcare as they actually need, right? And that's not necessarily everybody's vision. I think everybody should be protected under the law. I think that the issues around criminal justice reform and how African Americans and Latinos are treated under the law versus how whites are treated is something that has to be addressed. I think things like labor market discrimination related to that same issue has to be resolved.
So you can fall asleep. Let's try another story. I'll be good. Little Red Riding Hood. Take this basket of goodies to Grandma, said Little Red Riding Hood's mother, but don't stray far from the path.
Particularly in the U.S., where so many people come from all over the world, right? We've just elected in the last election the first Asian members, Southeast Asian members. We have a member from Taiwan in the Senate now. We have a member from India, a Persian member now. And so even in the context of world affairs, all of these things have to be taken into account, and understanding that this country is not a monolith. It was never created to be a monolith. And so we really have to do our best to be a leader, not just in how we treat our own people, but what our relationship is with other countries. What we've seen under this current president is a contraction in those values, both democratic values here in this country, as we've kind of uplifted suppression of votes, right, and interference in our elections, and contractions of our economy as we have put tariffs and instead of having kind of open conversations about trade, where trade has been restricted and where the cost of business has actually gone up for many of our business owners around the country. And so that's what I'm looking for in a candidate. I have actually recently endorsed former Vice President Joe Biden for president, and so I'm looking forward to him becoming the Democratic nominee, and then hopefully eventually our president. And I trust him to lead the country with a steady hand, and to make the decisions that I think are the best decisions for every American, whether you're in New York or Cali or any place in between.